So 3 things in my time that I'd like to give you the headlines for, to share some ideas with you. And the first is keeping the main thing, which is the title of this conference. Can we keep learning first, please? Every day. I'm going to unpick a bit of that. Second thing I'd like to unpack a bit with you is the notion of playing with a bit of fire. Because most of what we do, most of the time, is not brain surgery, and nobody's going to die. So it does mean we can afford to take a few risks. And the third thing I'd like to just share a few ideas on is around the notion of labels and setting and labeling children. Tim said just now, you've got children going around saying, I'm a level 3. Now, I hear this quite a lot in my work, even now, even though levels have gone. And I always stop the child and I say, no, you're not a level 3 or a level 4. You're a human being. And that piece of work might be a level 3. Let's have a look at it. Okay. Got to be really careful that any signifier that we give to a child's work is only a signifier. A number is only a number, and it only takes us so far. And we've got to the stage in too many contexts where the numbers are king. No, they're not. They only become really robust pieces of information when we're triangulating them primarily from 2 sources. And the first is children's work, and the second is what they say. And then we can see whether the number is secure or not. So first of all, keeping the main thing. And these are just sharing some thoughts on what I'm seeing in schools, both as an invited guest into some schools and as an uninvited guest where I'm less popular. So certainly when I arrive, not by the time I've finished, because I'm a firm believer in all this work we're doing. And I think we're on the cusp of something really transformational. And I think we've got to have some really robust conversations, both with ourselves and our own practice, myself included, and with our colleagues. But if we're human beings first and we're professionals second, if our children are human beings first and young professionals second, we can have some really tough conversations about the stuff and the work and still leave the individual intact. But we're not doing ourselves or the profession or this really interesting journey that we're on if we start sort of stepping back saying, I want to hurt people's feelings. I'm not hurting anyone's feelings, I'm hurting the feelings of that piece of work, which is inanimate. Keeping the main thing, I would think we all need to be asking ourselves this every day and of every child. What is the difference between the task and the learning? And we are too often falling into the trap of saying, fantastic, nice work, well done, on absolutely no evidence other than that the child has filled in a piece of paper, without any checking of what the quality of that is. So there's 2 strands I just want to pick up in terms of that. First is, I think we ought to be editing cheap praise. Kids see through it. We should be praising far less and only for stuff that is really worthwhile. But otherwise, we're sending the signal that completing a piece of work is the work. No, it's not. Doing the work is the work, not completing a worksheet so that it's finished, or drawing lines across for some definitions. I don't know as a teacher whether that child has got it unless I've asked them some questions about it. And I think what's happening with what I'm calling cheap praise, and I see it in books as well, it's a quick sign-off to move to the next thing, which is getting in the way of learning first. And I'm on a stuck cycle. I'm quoting Tim when he says, fewer things in greater depth. Fewer things in greater depth. And in the YouTube video from the DFE from 2.5, 3 years or so ago now, when Tim is talking about the principles of the new curriculum and the principles behind it, he says no fewer than 3 times in about 6 minutes, fewer things in greater depth. And I don't think as a profession we've really got our heads around this. And we've got masses to cover. Well, frankly, content coverage trumping children's learning is an absolute nonsense. There is stuff to get through, but most of what we're teaching our children is underpinned by a handful of big concepts. And what's happening, if we don't pay attention to the big conceptuals, the big ideas, then all they've got is a load of little dots which never get joined up. And what happens when we pay attention to the big concepts, the big ideas, when we then put on the massive content, it's much stickier. because what we've done is we've developed the intellectual architecture internally where the child can then make sense of it. Now that doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes children go backwards. Well, frankly, that is life. That is when the learning takes place, because if the learning is too neat and it's looking on a nice flight path, that isn't learning. That's just a nice graph. I'm urging people to think very, very carefully about what is the big concept or the big idea, and if my learning intention or key line of inquiry is to complete a worksheet, again, what's sitting behind that? I'm not allergic to worksheets per se, but what is the stuff that is sitting behind that? And where I see this really quite often is the fragmentation, and I understand why it's happened in terms of teaching English to children, particularly at Key Stage 2. Now, English is bigger than prepositional clauses. So I can look at 20 or 30 books and the key learning and the title for today's prepositional clauses for weeks on end. You know. We're doing ourselves and our children a great disservice if we're not locating this in the big story of literature and literacy in which there are prepositional clauses. Okay? So what we're doing is we're mistaking the bits for the whole. And it's tough work because it's not immediately obvious always what the key concepts are, except they are all there in the national curriculum. Let's go back and revisit those, and then we pin on the rest behind it. Cambridge Assessment and others are developing, and we've actually all got great questions out there. If we just look and get our children to go and find some questions. We're going to be learning about this next time. Can you go and look up some questions? Much more location and locating the onus of the learning and the research with children and in their own time. There is masses of potential in the Bloom's questions, for instance. It's a fabulous way of differentiating from one piece of key knowledge. What do I know about it? What do I understand it? How can I apply this? How can I analyze it? How can I evaluate it? How might I create new knowledge from it? Now, the problem is it's become bastardized in a lot of contexts into lower order questions and higher order questions. No, they're just a range of questions. So don't let's privilege one over the other and say, oh, I'm giving them some challenge, I'm getting them to evaluate. Yeah, but they don't know we've got to give them some knowledge and understanding first. So we need a lot of knowledge which we then play with, and it's through the questioning that we start playing with it. Now, I don't know who might already be quite sophisticated in something that I'm going to be talking about, and that's where the Bloom's questions come in, because I can then start pointing them towards different kinds of questions that I'm going to want them to come up with in relation to the knowledge. Why should I be asking the questions the whole time? Now, sitting around this as well, if we're talking about big concepts and big ideas, it's really important that we're offering our children sophisticated technical language with which to engage and with which to make sense of the content. They need this in order to enter into the arena and the domain of the curriculum area. They need it, incidentally, for their GCSEs and their A-levels. Those are important, but they need it per se. Now, if we've got children at the age of 4 who can talk with some fluency about Tyrannosaurus rex, why are we spoon-feeding them or dumbing down some of the key terminology? And when children know that a Tyrannosaurus rex is a scary lizard, and a lot of children do know that at 4, why are we not getting into the etymology of most of the words that we're working with? So we wouldn't have got into the cytoplasmic muddle if the children were told, go and research what cytoplasm is. And I think cytos is a basket, which starts making sense. I think it is. Someone can check, I don't know. But there is key terminology, and the Michaela School and others, Joe Kirby and others, if you're on Twitter and you're watching any of these blogs, some really interesting stuff is coming out of this in terms of really demanding some difficult stuff from our children. Now, when I'm talking with colleagues about definitions and etymology, they're all, yes, we do that. What they're doing is meanings. I think we're missing a trick if we're not absolutely going into where did this word come from? And we don't need to be classicists to do it, but virtually all the technical language that's sitting in subject domains has got classical roots. I'm going to give those to my students and say, you've got a couple to go and research, come back and tell us you've got a couple over there. What you're doing is you're creating a story about what that sits around. Now, someone not deliberately tried to catch me up, but it felt at the time when I'd been banging on about this, as I do quite a lot. It was a maths expert, Max the Maths, and he said, "Oh, Mary, what's isosceles then?" So unfortunately I remembered, just to save time, it's equal legs. Isos is equal and skelos is legs. And now if I know that, it kind of gives something more concrete to be thinking about isosceles triangles. And then I thought, oh gosh, in case he catches me out again, I can't remember what area means. I quickly Googled it. And do you know what it means? It comes from the Greek for an empty space. That kind of makes sense, doesn't it? It's the area of something. It's the empty space in between. So we can start building up a narrative and a story around this, and I keep saying, we don't need to be doing all the work on this. We dump this on our children, because they can do it before, they can do it later. The other thread in terms of keeping learning first is that we need to be paying much more attention to what children say. And I'm not talking about getting down with the kids. I'm not talking about pandering to their whims. I'm talking about what is it that comes out of their mouth that tells me that they've got it, or where else it might need to go. Now, Tim talks a lot about products. How do we know whether children got it? They produce stuff, which could be artifacts, which could be the responses to an exam question or a test. And day by day, it's the stuff that they say in classrooms. Now, what I'm observing too much on, whether learning first is not at the top of the agenda, is a superficial response because I'm getting on to the next thing. No. I'm going to dig and probe, and I'm going to see if someone else agrees. I'm going to be getting them talking in pairs, and I'm going to be earwigging to see whether these children are really talking about the stuff. I've already mentioned a bit about the English, but I think SPAG is really important. But, you know, literacy is bigger than SPAG. You know, our children will have SPAG on their tombstones. I mean, God knows what. There's huge amounts of research going on that tests are where the learning happens. It's in the process of trying to find the information. And funnily enough, if I've got it wrong, there's some research which is saying, I learn better when I do it next time. There's something going on cognitively, so we mustn't shy away from giving our children lots of low-stakes testing. Next thing I just want to refer to quickly is I want to urge people to be playing more with fire. Now, I haven't been paid to say this, but there's a new book coming out by Mike Fairclough from West Side Junior, a book called Playing with Fire. And you might have heard him on the, I don't know, he's been in the press a bit because he has a herd of buffalo. I was going to say on the farm, but actually in his school. He teaches the children to shoot, clay pigeon shooting, and they build fires and they do all sorts of extraordinary things. But he's built a curriculum which is absolutely robust, signed off by, does it really matter, but it does up to a point, signed off by Ofsted. More importantly, signed off by the Chief Executive of the Health and Safety Committee, of the Health and Safety Executive, who's using it as a case study of how to manage risk gas appropriately. This chap has built a curriculum around fire, around buffaloes, and around a Bronze Age swamp, which happens to be next door to his school. Now, what I don't want people saying is, I couldn't do that because I haven't got a Bronze Age swamp next to me. In all our settings, we have got resources we can use, or bring them on. Alison brought a bus in. Use, muck about a bit. Not every single thing has to count in that moment, in that minute. And I do urge you to read that because it's very funny, and you'll get some ideas from it. Most of what we do isn't brain surgery, and mostly we don't die. Can we stop talking about low ability, high ability, middle ability? It's so limiting. Can we talk about low prior attainment? That's much more specific. High prior attainment. I think we're going to look through at the discourse of ability in times to come through the same lens as sexism and racism. And I have been hammered for that on Twitter, so if it gets out there again, I'm happy to defend it. It is quite radical. I'm not diminishing those things, but we are putting some serious limits on our children and their potential when we label them and limit them. And they know. They know. You can disguise it, but they know. Thank you, colleagues.